Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to extract the most important insights from key sources. Today, we're embarking on quite a journey, I think, into the profound wisdom of Rumi's The Masnavi, Book 1.
That's right, a truly foundational text.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a specific section of this, well, spiritual masterpiece. We'll be looking at key poetic passages, the symbols, the metaphors Rumi weaves in, the spiritual lessons, of course, and their deeper meanings. And ultimately, we want to try and bridge Rumi's ancient insights directly to your personal understanding. What does this timeless wisdom mean for you today?
Indeed. And we're drawing directly from a really powerful excerpt of the Masnavi, Book 1. It includes that remarkable story of Zayd and his visionary encounter with the prophet.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and alongside that, other potent parables and spiritual reflections. So this isn't just like a literary analysis. It's really an exploration of a kind of spiritual map for navigating the human experience.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should probably start with that exchange you mentioned between the prophet and this figure Zayd. It's quite something. The prophet starts with what seems like a pretty simple question, right? My friend, how have you woken up today?
Right, just a normal question on the surface.
But Zayd's answer, it immediately shows a depth that goes way beyond, a morning pleasantry.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating here is that Eid's response, it's so immediate and, well, deeply charged. He says, like a believing slave who knows what's true.
Wow. Okay.
And then he describes this state of intense spiritual experience. It sounds utterly transcendent, really. He talks about an insatiable thirst, sleeplessness, a love so profound it's like it's burning him away.
Burning him away.
Yeah. He tells the prophet he's moved beyond both day and nighttime sphere. It suggests a realm where earthly time just loses all meaning.
Like time doesn't exist there.
Exactly. Where 1,000 years and 1 hour are the same.
Yeah.
He says it's a place so profound that the brain can't reach there. It soon gets submerged. It's this vision of a transcendent reality, a taste of eternity while still here in the body.
That's just an incredible vision. But I mean, for the average person listening, how do you even begin to grasp a state like that? Is it about like meditation or?
Well, Rumi isn't giving us a step-by-step guide here exactly, but Zayd's description points to a state that's born from intense spiritual yearning, intense love. It's less about intellectual understanding,
Right.
and more about experiential knowing. And it's that very experience the prophet then probes. He asks Zayd about his souvenir, like what knowledge, what insight does he bring back from this profound sort of unearthly state?
And Zayd's answer is just astounding. The scope, the detail. He doesn't just claim some vague spiritual insight.
No, not at all. He claims comprehensive divine sight. It's extraordinary.
He says he sees what? God's throne.
Precisely. Zayd claims to see not just the physical world, but God's throne with those who live on high, and even the 7 hells and the 8 heavens too.
Everything.
Everything. And he goes further. He says he can recognize each individual, like wheat and barley piled up at the mill.
So clearly.
Yes. Who's heaven bound and who in hell will bake? I see just like a fish next to a snake.
Yeah.
It implies this profound, almost precognitive spiritual sight into the actual destinies of souls. Like the final judgment is already an open book for him.
Wow. That is an extraordinary claim, complete spiritual clarity.
It really is.
And this level of, spiritual unveiling, it leads Rumi to use this powerful metaphor, doesn't it? The soul as a fetus.
That's right. The idea of the soul being like a fetus inside its womb within the body until death. And death in this context isn't an end. It's like birth pains.
A transition.
Exactly, a spiritual birth. And at this birth, Rumi says, the souls of all the dead watch and wait to see the way it's born in its new state.
And he uses that image of the Africans and the Greeks.
Yes, a poignant image. Some souls, the Africans, might claim it as ours, if it's, spiritually bad or darkened, while others, the Greeks, would recognize it as glorious with great powers if it's good or enlightened. But then crucially, he immediately says that in this realm of souls and grace, the blacks and whites are equal.
Ah, okay.
It's Rumi's characteristic way, using these historical or societal distinctions of his time as a dramatic contrast, only to immediately dissolve them. He's emphasizing that in the spiritual reality, true worth lies far beyond skin color or origin.
Right, so it underlines this idea of true spiritual sight.
Exactly. This concept deeply emphasizes that true spiritual sight, which Rumi describes as seeing by the light of God, lets you see straight through a person's skin so easily.
Seeing the essence.
Precisely.
Hmm.
It suggests that the very essence of sperm, our origin, is pure goodness like the light, beyond the realm of what is black or white. And this isn't just, a beautiful poetic line. It's a radical call to look beyond those first impressions in others, and maybe even in ourselves. To see that inherent spiritual essence that truly defines us. It's a reminder that beneath all the superficial stuff, our core is fundamentally pure.
And Zayd, he concludes this part of the conversation with just such a bold claim. He says, "As if it is already Judgment Day, I see through men and women here today."
He's completely overwhelmed by this vision.
Utterly so confident in his insight that he even offers right then and there to tear open this last veil and disclose the whole resurrection secret. Like he's ready to spill all the divine mysteries.
Which naturally raises a really important question. Why doesn't the prophet let him? Why not reveal all this profound, unveiled truth right there?
Yeah, why hold back?
And Rumi shows us the prophet's immediate response. It's
Yeah.
gentle, but it's firm, an intervention.
Hmm.
It suggests there's a very profound reason for this spiritual concealment.
So how does the prophet respond? Zayd seems almost drunk on this vision.
He does. Rumi says he seems drunken, wasted, almost dead with this spiritual intoxication. And the prophet says to him, "Your horse is growing excited, pull the reins."
So that
Exactly. God feels no shame, and you now none remains. He tells Zayd, "Your mirror has slipped out of its own cover," but emphasizes that scales and mirrors must always speak truthfully. It's like recognizing the truth of Zayd's vision, but also cautioning against just letting it all hang out unrestrained.
So put the mirror back in its case.
That's essentially it. The prophet tells him to put the spiritual mirror back in its case. He acknowledges Zayd's vision is true. He says, "Your breast's been split like Sinai by God's face," which is such a powerful reference, right, to Moses on Mount Sinai.
A direct encounter with the divine.
Absolutely, signifying a direct, transformative, divine encounter. But the prophet understands that some truths are just too potent, too overwhelming for people who aren't ready.
Too much, too soon.
Yeah, Rumi puts it beautifully. The sun of truth and pre-eternity can't be stuffed in one's arms so none can see. You can't just hide the sun. And the prophet uses that simple, powerful analogy. Place fingers on your eyes, and you won't see the sun begin to rise. The world gets covered by a single tip.
Even a small barrier, or just not being ready, can block out immense truth.
If our capacity is limited, yes.
So, okay, if Zayd's vision is true, and the truth is ultimately meant to be known, why the need for concealment? What's the spiritual lesson there for us? It feels like a delicate balance.
It really is. And stepping back, what Rumi seems to be revealing here is a fundamental principle of spiritual development. He explains that God's wish is to stay hidden still today.
But why?
Well, it's not about secrecy just for the sake of it. It seems to be for the spiritual development and, frankly, the growth of humanity. People, Rumi says, prince and prisoner alike, they need hope and fear.
Hope and fear.
Yes, as component parts of the thick veil that's covering their hearts. This veil allows us to worship, to strive, to develop spiritually. Without it, Rumi suggests there's only might and strong rule in the unseen. Perhaps a reality human consciousness isn't quite ready to bear or integrate fully.
So the veil encourages effort, humility.
Exactly. It fosters humility, encourages that striving, and allows for a gradual unfolding of truth, one that builds true capacity, rather than potentially overwhelming and, destroying someone spiritually.
That makes a lot of sense.
The takeaway is pretty profound, I think. Sometimes the greatest gifts aren't those immediate blinding revelations, but the patient process of seeking and striving itself. That's what builds character, capacity. It's why growth often happens in the dark, metaphorically speaking, not just in the easy light.
Right, right. That really connects to how the prophet describes himself, doesn't it? As honey mixed with vinegar to heal your heart of the affliction that you feel.
And the medicine.
Yeah, like his light is intentionally faint compared to the supreme light so that humanity can actually cope with it. He's offering a palatable, a digestible version of truth, a kind of spiritual medicine.
Carefully calibrated.
Exactly. Until the heart is completely healthy and passion-free for God alone, it's a gradual unfolding, not that sudden blinding light that might just overwhelm you, like a doctor giving the right dose.
A perfect analogy. So this whole deep dive, it reveals that while some truths need to be veiled for our own good, for our progression, there's also this immense subtle power within us that Rumi really wants us to recognize.
Okay.
And that leads him into this whole concept of the heart's incredible control, its inherent sovereignty.
Right, the heart's power. He presents this really astonishing idea, doesn't he, about the streams of heaven.
Yes, that even heaven streams like Salsabil and Zanjabil, these are names of specific rivers in paradise from the Quran, symbols of ultimate divine blessing.
Okay.
While they are ruled in heaven by the King of Kings, they are also somehow ruled by you and me through the Lord's decree. He says we can make them flow where we want, like magic.
Which isn't literal control over rivers, obviously.
No, of course not. It's a profound metaphor, right? For the human soul's potential influence on reality when it's aligned with divine will. It illustrates the spiritual power that's latent within each of us.
And this power extends to our physical senses, too.
Absolutely. Rumi says, all outward senses are in flow this way. The heart's decree these 5 pipes must obey. Our hands, our feet, he writes, obey the heart's command, like Moses' rod.
Like Moses' rod.
Just as Moses' rod became this instrument of divine power, transforming things, commanding elements, Rumi suggests our own bodies, our hands and feet, become extensions of the heart's aligned intention. They'll dance, or flee, or write, whatever the heart intends. There's this unseen inside, which has arranged the body's form outside.
The internal guiding the external, spirit manifesting through the physical.
Precisely.
But that raises the question, how does the heart instruct them so profoundly? What gives it that kind of authority?
And that's where Rumi introduces that powerful metaphor, King Solomon's ring.
Ah.
The heart's power, he suggests, is such that it can gain this legendary ring.
Yeah.
And having it allows the heart to restrain the outward senses and even make the inward ones too follow its decrees.
So total inner command.
This sovereignty of the heart, the qalb in Sufi terms, it's a cornerstone of their thought. The idea is that when the spiritual heart is purified, it becomes like a clear mirror, reflecting divine will. And then it truly orchestrates our inner and outer worlds.
Like Solomon's ring controlled spirits and elements.
Exactly. The pure, connected heart possesses this innate sovereignty over our entire being, both inner and outer. It really boils down to cultivating that inner purity and alignment.
And this is where it gets really impactful, personally, I think. Rumi ties this directly to our spiritual state, our integrity. He says, if you're free from deceit here in this land, then no demon then can steal it from your hand. No demon can steal the ring.
Right. Your inner authority remains intact.
And in that state, he says, the universe will be ruled by your name, the way you rule your body, just the same. It's this promise of profound harmony, profound control, both inside and out. Imagine that kind of self-mastery.
It's incredible. But there's a flip side, isn't there?
Oh, yes. A serious warning. If a demon steals the seal from you, steals that ring, your kingdom will be gone.
Meaning your inner sovereignty.
Yeah. Leading to misery until Judgment Day, because your soul won't be saved from the scales and mirror. You lose that connection, that guidance.
That's such a stark warning about the cost of inner corruption, isn't it? Or just spiritual negligence, maybe. Losing that seal is like losing your inner compass.
Your connection to divine guidance.
Yeah. In modern terms, it might feel like losing your sense of purpose, feeling fragmented, or just being totally at the mercy of external pressures or your own unchecked impulses.
It's the difference between being the master of your inner world
and being a slave to its whims.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And to really drive this home, this idea of inner truth coming out, the consequences of hidden actions, Rumi tells that captivating story of Loqman.
Ah, Loqman, yes. He was described as a dark-skinned servant, outwardly kind of despised by his peers, but Rumi tells us immediately he was mystically a king.
That contrast again, outward appearance versus inner reality.
It's key. So the story goes, he and other servants are sent to gather fruit for their master, but the others, driven by greed, secretly eat the fruit themselves.
And then blame Loqman.
Exactly. To cover their tracks, they point the finger at him.
So the master, he suspects something's up.
He does. He's wise. He devises this clever and probably quite uncomfortable test. Everyone has to drink hot water and then run.
Hot water? Why hot water?
Well, it seems designed to bring out what's hidden inside. A
Yeah.
sort of spiritual lie detector test, if you will.
Okay, so what happens?
What's fascinating is the outcome. As they run, the other servants, well, they vomit up the fruit they'd secretly eaten. Their deceit is revealed. But when it's Loqman's turn, Rumi says, water is all he brought up from inside. He had nothing to hide. His insides were clean.
So the hot water revealed the truth.
Precisely. And Rumi uses this to teach a profound spiritual lesson. That day when all the secrets are revealed, what you would like to hide can't be concealed. He says those drafts of hot water that for each are poured will tear all veils away from what's abhorred.
So it's not just about stolen fruit.
Not at all. It's about the truth of our character. It inevitably comes out, often through challenges, crises, the hot water moments in life.
That really shows how those difficult times, that hot water, they reveal our true inner state, our integrity or, our lack of it.
Hmm.
And Rumi connects this inner truth to our relationships too, right?
Yeah.
And our spiritual alignment. He says, bad women to the bad men now dictate an ugly woman is a vile man's mate.
Yes, it's a metaphor, really, for how like attracts like. Not just in romance, but in all our connections, all our influences. Our inner state tends to draw its spiritual match, whether that's positive or negative.
So you choose your company, in a way.
Or rather, your inner state chooses its company. And the application here is presented as a profound choice for you, the seeker. Whichever mate fulfills your fantasies, become effaced in that one's qualities.
Effaced.
Meaning identify with, become absorbed in,
Yeah.
embody those qualities. If you seek light, you need to reflect light, like a star. If you long to be free from this vile jail, this prison of worldly attachments and spiritual blindness, Rumi advises, prostrate before him, move near constantly.
So align your whole being.
Exactly. Align your very essence with what you truly desire, whether that's light and freedom, or maybe, consciously or unconsciously, darkness and confinement. It's a call to identify with and really embody the qualities you aspire to. Make them your own.
And then Rumi circles back to the path to enlightenment. He says something quite paradoxical, that the water of eternal life is found close to the dark.
Yes. That's intriguing, isn't it? It suggests that profound spiritual insight often doesn't come just from constant sunshine and ease.
Right.
It emerges from struggles, from deep introspection, maybe from confronting difficult truths within ourselves in those darker corners.
And he warns against eating what's dead. What does that mean?
It's a powerful metaphor for spiritual heedlessness, getting caught up in deadening habits, things that numb us spiritually. He says this leads to sleep death deep, making you vulnerable to foes made of fire.
Foes made of fire.
He clarifies, referring to the fire of lust and other unchecked desires, which he says can take you straight to hell. It's a really clear call to wakefulness, to intentional living, a reminder that spiritual apathy, just drifting along, has real, potentially destructive consequences.
It makes me think how easy it is, just in our daily lives, to fall into those dead habits. Mindlessly scrolling, consuming stuff without really engaging.
Absolutely.
Things that can dull our spiritual senses, just like Rumi's sleep death deep. It's not always the big, dramatic vices, is it? Sometimes it's that subtle, everyday carelessness that just gradually erodes our inner vitality.
So true. A constant vigilance is required, it seems.
Well, this deep dive into Rumi's Masnavi has really taken us on quite a journey, from Zayd's incredible vision to the prophet's deep wisdom on why some truths maybe need to remain veiled for our own good, and then right down into the immense, subtle power sitting within our own hearts.
Yet broadening the scope a bit, Rumi is really guiding us to understand, first, that there is this profound inner world that's accessible through sincere spiritual effort, and it can reveal astonishing truths, like Zayd saw. But also that our hearts have this incredible capacity, this power to govern our experience, our perceptions, like having King Solomon's ring. And the stories, Zayd's and Loqman's, they ultimately illustrate that truth, whether it's hidden or revealed, maybe through tough times, that truth determines our reality, our destiny. It really is a call to inner integrity, constant self-awareness.
Which definitely raises an important question for you listening right now. In this world with just so much information, so many voices shouting, what truths are you truly seeking?
That's a great question.
And are you only looking for them in the obvious places, in the easy light? Or are you perhaps willing to seek that water of eternal life that Rumi says can be found close to the dark, in those less comfortable, maybe more challenging corners of introspection and life experience?
And as you reflect on that, maybe consider how cultivating humility, serving others, even without recognition, like Rumi describes, how that might be more valuable for your spiritual journey than just outward displays of faith or knowledge.
Yeah.
And remember that core message from Loqman's story. Your inner integrity, ultimately, will be revealed, regardless of how well you think you've concealed it.
Powerful stuff. We really hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective and maybe some truly memorable insights to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of Rumi's timeless wisdom.